They were built like gods, but they bled like men. On screen, they hurled chariots, broke chains, and stared down monsters with a clenched jaw and an oiled chest. In the golden age of sword and sandal epics, playing Hercules was the ultimate badge of strength, a shortcut to stardom. Or so they were told. But behind the myth was a much messier truth. These roles weren't filmed on Mount Olympus. They were shot on crumbling backlots and sun-scorched locations where budgets ran dry, stunts went wrong, and actors pushed their bodies past the breaking point. Some couldn't act, some couldn't speak the language, and some were never meant to wear the crown of a demigod at all. For every box office hit, there were quiet disasters. Careers ended as quickly as they began. And the man who once ruled the screen in sandals and a sword, he might be pumping gas a year later. 12 men became Hercules. Few walked away unscathed. Stick around, because the real myth isn't what happened on screen. It's what happened when the cameras stopped rolling. Reg Park, the bodybuilder who walked into hell and took Hercules with him. Reg Park wasn't just strong. He looked like strength had been carved into human form. A 3-time Mr. Universe from Leeds, England, Park stepped onto Italian movie sets in the early 1960s like a man sculpted for myth. But there was something different about him, something Steve Reeves didn't have: darkness. Where Reeves played Hercules with shining nobility, Reg Park brought shadows into the frame. In Hercules in the Haunted World, 1961, he descended into the underworld, not just in the plot, but in tone. Gothic castles, lava pits, skeleton armies. This was no glorious battlefield. It was a fever dream. And Park, stoic and silent, fought through it like a man trying to punch his way out of a nightmare. That's what made him unforgettable. Park's Hercules wasn't just strong, he was burdened. Heavy, almost tragic. His strength didn't save him from the madness around him. It only made him the last one left standing. Off-screen, Park was nothing like the dark demigod he played. He was calm, grounded, fiercely disciplined. He trained a young Arnold Schwarzenegger, not just in bodybuilding, but in mindset. It was Reg who told him, you can be more than a champion. You can be a star. But Reg himself never chased stardom. He made a few films, raised a family, built gyms, and quietly became a legend in a different way. The spotlight was never the goal. The legacy was. When fans talk about Hercules today, they mention the strength, the muscles, the battles. But Reg Park brought something that's harder to imitate: soul. And when Hercules walked through hell, it was Park who proved a god could look afraid and keep going anyway. Mark Forrest, the replacement nobody wanted, until he became irreplaceable. Mark Forrest never set out to become Hercules. Born Lou Ferrigno in Brooklyn, he was a champion bodybuilder with classical features and a carefully sculpted physique. When Steve Reeves abruptly stepped away from the role that had launched 1,000 peplum films, Italian producers were desperate to find someone who could carry the mantle. Forrest fit the look. He had the mass, the jawline, the quiet stoicism. But he wasn't Reeves, and that fact clung to him like a shadow. His first outing, Goliath and the Dragon, 1960, was a Hercules film in everything but name. The studio didn't trust the audience to accept a new face, so they changed the title for the American release, hoping no one would notice. It didn't work. Critics called him a copy. Audiences were hesitant. And Forrest, just in his early 20s, found himself caught between a role too big and a legacy too fresh. Yet what could have been a single misstep became the beginning of something larger. Forrest kept working. With each new film, Hercules against the Sons of the Sun, Hercules against the Mongols, Mesiste in the Valley of the Kings, his performances deepened. He wasn't just flexing, he was acting. His Hercules was younger, more impulsive, a fighter still growing into his myth. Over time, he earned respect not just for the physique, but for his presence, steady, reliable, and surprisingly emotive in a genre that rarely demanded it. Still, as the sword and sandal wave began to crash, Forrest saw the genre's end approaching. While many of his peers scrambled for work or clung to fading fame, he made a clean break. He returned to the U.S., studied voice, and pursued a career in opera. The former, Hercules, traded the battlefield for the stage, and the roar of lions for the resonance of Italian arias. In a world where most musclemen faded quietly, Mark Forrest did something rare. He walked away with grace and found a second act on his own terms. Mickey Hargitay, the Hercules who wasn't the star of his own story. When Mickey Hargitay stepped into the role of Hercules in The Loves of Hercules, 1960, he already looked like a comic book hero come to life. He had been Mr. Universe. He had trained with weights before it was fashionable. His body was all sharp lines and coiled strength, the kind that made producers take one look and say, "That's our man." But by the time the cameras rolled, something else had already happened. Mickey Hargitay had become a supporting character in his own life. He wasn't just playing Hercules. He was playing opposite his wife, the impossibly glamorous Jane Mansfield, a walking publicity machine, a Hollywood blonde bombshell designed to dazzle flashbulbs and blur headlines. Wherever Hargitay went, so did Mansfield. Even the posters for their film leaned into it. Jane Mansfield in The Loves of Hercules, with Mickey's name trailing behind. He was a strongman in service of someone else's spectacle. Yet there was more to Hargitay than the tabloids ever printed. He was born in Hungary, survived Nazi-occupied Europe, and immigrated to the United States with nothing. Every bicep, every glint of movie star polish had been earned. He hadn't grown up chasing cameras. He had escaped war, dug ditches, learned English, and turned himself into something bigger than fate had planned. The glitz of Hollywood was never the goal, it was a detour. His turn as Hercules was brief, and critics were lukewarm. The film, low budget and romanticized, was more spectacle than substance. But Hargitay wasn't clinging to the role. When the spotlight shifted, he let it go. He stepped away from film, built a family, and lived quietly, raising children, one of whom, Mariska Hargitay, would go on to command a screen in ways he never could. Mickey Hargitay's Hercules wasn't the loudest or the longest lasting. But in a business obsessed with self-promotion, his strength was quieter. A man who could walk beside a legend and still carry his own weight. Kirk Morris, the beach boy who got lost in myth. They found him on the sand, shirtless, sun-kissed, a Venetian gondolier turned bodybuilder, barely out of his teens. He hadn't trained for Hollywood. He hadn't studied under masters. But to Italian producers in the early 1960s, he had something more important than pedigree, a body that looked like it had stepped straight out of myth. Born Adriano Bellini, he was renamed Kirk Morris before his first line was even dubbed. The name sounded American, strong, marketable, a clean fit for international posters. Within months, he was Hercules, then Maciste, then Goliath. To the studios, it didn't matter what they called the hero. The formula was the same: a monster to fight, a kingdom to save, a torso to worship. Morris starred in more than a dozen films over just a few years: Hercules, Samson, and Ulysses, Hercules against the Mongols, Conqueror of Atlantis. The titles were loud, the budgets modest, the expectations low. Scenes were shot in deserts and quarries, scripts rewritten on set, and costumes reused from one film to the next. Morris, barely in his 20s, carried entire productions on his shoulders, sometimes literally. There was little glamour behind the scenes. The hours were punishing, the conditions rough, and few of these films made any lasting impression beyond their initial release. But Morris kept showing up, chest bare, sword drawn, eyes locked on a horizon that rarely changed. For a while, that was enough. Then the roles dried up. Unlike some of his peers, Morris didn't chase a second act. He quietly disappeared from a screen in the late 1960s and never returned. No scandal, no reinvention, just silence, as if the gods had called him back to wherever Hercules comes from when no one's watching. In the end, Kirk Morris wasn't the loudest Hercules or the longest lasting. But for a brief, sun-drenched moment, he was exactly what the myth machine needed: beautiful, brawny, and just mysterious enough to vanish without a trace. Alan Steele, the Hercules who smiled through the madness. If Steve Reeves was the classic Hercules and Reg Park the haunted one, then Alan Steele was the one who seemed to be in on the joke. Born Sergio Ciani, a Roman bodybuilder with a charming grin and chest like a marble wall, Steele stepped into the lion's skin at a time when the genre was beginning to unravel, and instead of fighting it, he embraced the chaos. By the mid-1960s, sword and sandal films had slipped from grand myth to glorified pulp. Budgets were shrinking. Scripts were nonsense. Monsters were made of papier-mâché. In Hercules Against the Moon Men, 1964, Steele battled alien invaders inside a story that felt like it had been stitched together from 3 other movies, and somehow, he made it work. He didn't smirk at the camera, but he didn't pretend he was in Ben-Hur either. There was a knowing quality in his performance, a wink just beneath the surface, as if to say, "Yes, this is ridiculous, but look at me doing it anyway." And audiences loved him for it. Unlike some of his stiffer predecessors, Steele moved with confidence. He fought like he meant it. He had fun. There was an effortless physicality to his performances that elevated even the most absurd material. Whether in Hercules and the Masked Rider or Samson and the Slave Queen, He brought energy, presence, and just enough humanity to keep the fantasy afloat. Off-screen, Steele wasn't chasing awards or foreign press attention. He was a working actor proud of what he did, often playing Hercules or Hercules-adjacent characters under a dozen different names. And when the genre finally collapsed under its own weight, he didn't try to reinvent himself. He stepped away, content with what he'd done. Not the most respected Hercules, but maybe the most self-aware. Alan Steele didn't elevate the genre. He rode it like a chariot through absurdity, with his head high, his sword drawn, and a smile that said, being Hercules didn't have to be serious to be unforgettable. Dan Vadas, the Hercules who came in swinging. Dan Vadas didn't look like he came down from Mount Olympus. He looked like he'd crashed through the gates with a fistful of trouble and a score to settle. Born Konstantin Daniel Vafiadis, a Greek-American with piercing eyes and a frame that seemed built for breaking things, he brought something new to the role of Hercules: raw, unpredictable energy. While his predecessors carried themselves like marble statues come to life, Vadas moved like a brawler who knew exactly how much damage he could do. In The Triumph of Hercules, 1964, and Hercules the Invincible, he didn't just strike poses, he threw himself into the chaos. His Hercules didn't walk into battle. He charged. There was no regal distance, no stoic detachment. There was heat, swagger, and sweat. He stood out because he felt real. Where earlier Hercules actors often seemed like mythic figures dropped into stories, Vadas was the first to feel like he'd actually lived in that brutal world. Someone who knew the weight of a sword, the cost of a mistake, the exhaustion behind the legend. His acting wasn't refined, but didn't need to be. His presence was enough. You believed he could lift a stone pillar, not because the script said so, but because you could see it in his eyes. He would. Off camera, Vadas wasn't easy to pin down. He moved in and out of the film world with the same force he brought to screen. After the peplum wave collapsed, he didn't disappear, he shifted gears. He joined Clint Eastwood's circle of regulars, taking smaller but memorable roles in gritty westerns and action films. He wasn't chasing stardom anymore. He was working, surviving, fighting in a different arena. Dan Vadas may not have been the clean-cut Hercules the studios first imagined, but he gave the myth its edge: fierce, feral, and unpolished. He didn't inherit the role. He took it. Lou Ferrigno, the last Hercules standing. By the time Lou Ferrigno picked up the sword, the age of Hercules had come and gone. The Colosseums were empty, the monsters looked tired, and audiences had moved on to space operas and streetwise vigilantes. But Ferrigno, already a living giant thanks to his role as the Incredible Hulk, wasn't trying to fit into the old myth. He was trying to resurrect it with more muscle, more lightning, and more pure, unfiltered chaos than ever before. In Hercules, 1983, and The Adventures of Hercules, 1985, Ferrigno wasn't just playing the demigod, he was redefining him for a generation that had traded in togas for tank tops. The films were wild, loud, and proudly absurd. One moment, he was tossing bears into space. The next, he was battling glowing robots or pulling continents back together with his bare hands. These weren't quiet character pieces. They were fever dreams carved out of neon and synth. And yet, through it all, Ferrigno committed. He never winked at the camera, never played it for laughs. He carried the myth the only way he knew how, seriously, physically, with a kind of stubborn dignity that held the madness together. While the special effects aged instantly, and the scripts seemed stitched together from comic books and serial commercials, Ferrigno remained believable. Not as an actor, necessarily, but as a force. Off-screen, he was already a legend. A deaf child who became Mr. Universe. A misunderstood giant who turned green rage into global fame. Hercules was, in many ways, a step down from what he'd already become. But he took the role anyway, perhaps because he understood better than anyone that sometimes myth is the only place where a man that size can truly belong. Lou Ferrigno wasn't the first Hercules or the best, but he was the last one bold enough to believe the myth still mattered, and big enough to make you believe it too. Steve Reeves, the man who looked like a god and paid the price for it. Before the superheroes wore capes and spandex, Steve Reeves wore a tunic, a sword, and the weight of Olympus on his shoulders. He wasn't just the first Hercules of the big screen era, he was the blueprint. When Hercules, 1958, thundered into theaters, Reeves' body was unlike anything audiences had seen. Sculpted, symmetrical, mythic. He wasn't just playing a demigod, to fans he was one. The film didn't just succeed, it exploded. Suddenly, every studio wanted their own Hercules, every gym rat wanted Reeves' physique, and Reeves himself? He wanted out. Because the truth was, Steve Reeves had never set out to be a sword and sandal icon. He dreamed of becoming a serious actor. But the world didn't want serious, they wanted sinew. And the more roles he turned down, the more studios backed away. His fame became a golden cage. Hercules made him a star, but it also made it nearly impossible to become anything else. And there was something else the posters didn't show. Pain. Literal chronic pain. During a chariot stunt in the last days of Pompeii, Reeves suffered a shoulder injury that never fully healed. It made every flex, every fight scene, every sword swing a quiet act of endurance. Eventually, he walked away from Hollywood altogether, choosing health over fame, or maybe choosing dignity over typecasting. Still, the image endured. Generations later, bodybuilders call him the golden ideal. Directors still reference his screen presence. And though his career was short, his impact was Herculean. He didn't just wear the lion's skin. He made it fit like destiny. Brad Harris, the Hercules who never missed a step. Brad Harris never broke into a scene with a roar. He didn't tear his shirt off or strike 1,000 poses. He didn't have to. His strength wasn't just in the body, it was in how he moved. Controlled. Measured. Like a man who knew exactly how to throw a punch without wasting a drop of energy. Born in California and built like a Golden Age Olympian, Harris came to Italy in the early 1960s and never really left. He arrived just as the sword and sandal wave was cresting, and while his name was never splashed across the top of movie posters the way Reeves or Park had been, directors knew what they were getting when they hired him. Consistency, discipline, and an actor who could hit his marks, carry the scene, and do his own stunts, all without losing breath or balance. Though he didn't always play Hercules by name, the roles were unmistakable, mythic men with impossible strength, fighting gods, tyrants, and beasts. In Goliath against the giants and Samson, Harris brought a grounded, almost modern energy to the screen. He didn't play Hercules as a symbol, he played him as a soldier. Focused, determined, quietly furious. The kind of man who could lift a stone column, but only if he had to. Unlike many of his muscle-bound peers, Harris didn't burn out or fade away. He adapted. When the genre shifted, he moved with it into Euro-spy thrillers, jungle adventures, and crime films. Behind the camera, he helped choreograph fights, handle stunts, and keep productions moving when everything else threatened to fall apart. He wasn't chasing stardom. He was building a career. Brad Harris never needed a shout to be noticed. His legacy is one of steadiness, a Hercules who didn't just look strong, but was strong where it mattered most, behind the scenes, under pressure, and in full control. Peter Lupus, the Hercules who tried to be more than muscles. Peter Lupus had the kind of face casting directors dreamed about, clean-cut, confident, and unmistakably American. He also had the kind of body that made cameras hesitate, not because it wasn't right for the role, but because it might overshadow everything else in the frame. When he was cast as Hercules in Hercules and the Tyrants of Babylon, 1964, he had all the right ingredients: strength, looks, poise. But what he wanted was something far harder to achieve: credibility. Like many actors in the peplum boom, Lupus wasn't given time to build a character. He was dropped into chaos, crumbling sound stages, erratic scripts, and lines often dubbed by someone else. He was expected to fight, flex, and look indestructible. And he did effortlessly. His Hercules was sharp, composed, with a soldier's bearing rather than a brute's rage. There was no madness in his performance, no wild-eyed, mythic fire. Just control. He made the role feel professional, almost polished, and maybe that was the problem. The film came and went, quickly swallowed by the glut of similar titles flooding theaters. But Lupus didn't vanish with it. In fact, he did something few Hercules actors ever managed. He crossed over. Under the name Rock Stevens, he carved out a niche in European action films. And then, in a move no one saw coming, he landed a lead role on American television as the soft-spoken strongman Willie Armitage on Mission: Impossible. Week after week, millions of viewers saw him not just as a body, but as a presence, part of a team, part of the story. Still, the shadow of Hercules never completely disappeared. For some, he would always be the man who once pulled down the walls of Babylon. For others, he was proof that muscle didn't have to mean mindless. Peter Lupus was the Hercules who tried to step out of the mold, and for a while, he actually did. Ed Fury, the Hercules who wasn't always called Hercules. Ed Fury didn't always play Hercules, but try telling that to the posters. In Italy, he was Ursus. In some dubs, he was Goliath. In others, Samson. But the image was always the same: golden curls, sunlit muscles, lion skin draped across shoulders like it had grown there. Audiences didn't care what name he answered to. They saw Hercules, or something close enough. Before the myth, there was modeling. Fury started in Los Angeles as a physique model, his image appearing in fitness magazines and art studies that treated the male form as living sculpture. He posed like a god long before he was cast as one. It wasn't long before European producers took notice. The body, the face, the air of effortless calm, he fit their mythic mold so perfectly it didn't seem to matter whether he could act. That was never really the point. In Ursus in the Valley of the Lions, 1961, and Ursus in the Land of Fire, 1963, Fury played the hero as noble, quiet, even gentle, a departure from the grunting, bellowing strongmen that often filled the screen. He wasn't the kind of Hercules who smashed temples or shouted commands. His strength was serene, almost romantic, as if he knew he was part of an illusion and played it gracefully, without breaking the spell. Yet that illusion came with limits. As the genre faded, so did the demand for men who looked like statues. Fury's last peplum roles came quietly. He returned to the US, took smaller roles, stepped behind the camera, and faded from the mythology that had once built itself around him. Ed Fury was the Hercules who never insisted on being remembered, which is why he still is. A figure more dream than man, caught in the strange space between art and action, myth and marketing. He didn't roar. He didn't rage. He simply stood still, and for a moment, that was enough to make him a god. The sword and sandal era may be long behind us, but the legacy of Hercules and the men who brought him to life still echoes across time. These actors stepped into a role larger than any script could hold. Some were legends, some were forgotten, but all of them carried a piece of the myth, and for a moment became something more than mortal. They weren't perfect, they weren't always praised, but they trained, they performed, and they gave everything they had, even when the spotlight faded, even when no one was watching. And now it's your turn to weigh in. Which of these men, in your eyes, was the true Hercules? Was it Steve Reeves, the icon who started it all? Lou Ferrigno, who brought brute force into the neon age? Or maybe one of the unsung names who quietly shouldered the myth and made it real? Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts, your memories, your favorites. These stories deserve to be remembered, and your voice helps keep them alive. If you enjoyed this journey through cinema's forgotten titans, give the video a like and consider subscribing. There are more legends to uncover, more faces behind the myths. Because the old gods never really die. They just wait for someone to look back.